Hello there! Welcome to all of you currently desperately trying to cool down in this horrific heat. Whilst it isn't the subject of this video, the past few days have been a visible demonstration of what climate change is doing to our planet. We must do more on this. Right, the Forde report. I'm going to first deal with the background of it. I'm then going to talk about the allegations and what Forde has found, what this means, and finally, what I think about this. Before I get to that, I'll just set out my position before somebody accuses me of bias. I am a leftist. I've been a leftist for most of my life. I'm not a Corbynite beyond a brief flirtation in 2015 in which I campaigned for him for the leadership. My opposition to Corbyn isn't ideological, it's practical, and that's something I'll probably expand upon later. What I'm saying is that this is an analysis from the left that isn't in hock to Corbyn, it isn't centrist, Blairite, or even right-wing analysis. That being said, if you want to skip the background information, you can go to this timestamp flashing on your screen now. So without further ado, let's get into it. The 2015 general election result was a shock loss for Labour and a surprise majority for the Conservatives. Out of this, Ed Miliband resigned and a leadership election was set up. Many MPs and members were exhausted. The New Labour project, which had so much success from 1997 to 2010, was both at its ideological end and had seemingly run out of steam. There was a lot of bad blood because the anointed New Labour successor in David Miliband was controversially defeated by his brother Ed as a result of Labour's electoral college vote. Ed never truly convinced in that role and was, despite his natural instincts, brought closer to the centre. He was never quite left, never quite centrist enough for either camp. Ed, perhaps sensing the discontent, had changed Labour's internal electoral college system to a one-member, one-vote system, and also included the chance for registered supporters to vote for a £3 fee. Post-election, with the candidates announcing, there was Andy Burnham, who at the time was called Flip-Flop Burnham, an exhausted Yvette Cooper, and Liz Kendall, who was determined to give Labour a hard dose of her perceived reality. At the start, I wasn't too enthused, I'm not going to lie. I was looking to support maybe Yvette Cooper, thinking a competent leader could do the job, but I wasn't too passionate about her. Then entered Jeremy Corbyn. Traditionally, the rump end of the left, the Socialist Campaign Group, typically enters a candidate to try and broaden the debate rather than win outright. In the last leadership election in 2010, it was John McDonnell. This time, it was decided Jeremy Corbyn would have a go. In a stunning and overwhelming win, Corbyn, against the wishes of the Parliamentary Labour Party, against the institution, won a huge majority of not only registered supporters and affiliates, but also the membership too. This caused great consternation amongst the more centrist aspects of Labour. Many were concerned this would be a repeat of 1983 and Michael Foot. Many were worried that Corbyn's lack of any experience would hamper him in dealing with the party machine. Many were also worried at the reaction of the press. The same press who had monstered Ed Miliband as Red Ed now had an extremely vulnerable and attractive target in Jeremy Corbyn. Beset by institutional and factional trouble, including a no-confidence vote from his own MPs, Corbyn struggled on, despite dire polling, and as a result, the new PM, Theresa May, feeling confident of her position, went for a general election. The result was that she lost her majority despite winning the election, and Labour, despite losing, feeling like they had won. 2017 was a shock. It saw the largest swing towards Labour since 1945 and was Labour's largest vote share since the heyday of Blair nearly 2 decades earlier. Many felt like, with more preparation and better support, they could have formed the next government. And no, Labour weren't 2,000 votes from victory. After this, the critics willing to be vocal died down, and with a change at conference, Corbyn had the NEC, that's National Executive, and Party Secretary he wanted. From there, despite more media disparagement and abysmal polling, Corbyn went into the 2019 election as he desired, and it was a disastrous defeat. The worst election loss for Labour since before the war. Corbyn resigned, Keir Starmer took over, commissioned the Forde report into the leaked report, and an acrimonious spirit has remained in Labour since. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission found the party institutionally anti-Semitic. Corbyn lost the whip for his response. His supporters believe that either there was no anti-Semitism or that it was exaggerated and used for political purposes. A leaked report into the party seemed to confirm all these suspicions and more, and as a result, Martin Forde QC was commissioned to investigate the document and the allegations therein. That's the quick rundown of the background into this. Let's start with the allegations. First, there was clear factionalism between the office of the leader and the permanent staff at HQ. Second, that the leader of the opposition's office interfered in the disciplinary process and that the GLU, that's Governance and Legal Unit staff, deliberately held up complaints to make the leader look bad. Third, factionalism prevented Labour from executing its opposition duties. Fourth, factions inside Labour deliberately sabotaged the 2017 election in order to stymie a Labour government led by Corbyn. Fifth, inadequate staff management exacerbated the problem of factionalism. Sixth, racism, sexism, and other discriminatory practices were commonplace against left-leaning MPs and staff without censure. Each one of these is a serious allegation and on their own should cause great worry. That all of them seemed to happen and seemed to be evidenced in the leaked report suggested something had gone very badly wrong in the UK's primary left-wing electoral vehicle. After months of delay, lawsuits and investigation by the Information Commissioner, the Forde report was released. So what has Forde actually found? Now let's get this out of the way early. The Forde report exonerates absolutely nobody. Not Jeremy Corbyn, not Ian McNichol, not Jenny Formby, not anyone. Every single person involved, named and unnamed, come out of this with dishonour on their name. Forde doesn't contradict the EHRC that there was an improper disciplinary system, and that meant the party's handling of anti-Semitism rendered it institutionally anti-Semitic. It doesn't contradict the EHRC that Corbyn's team pressured the GLU into not suspending the leader's friends and allies on anti-Semitism. If anything, it confirms the existence of such, and whilst we're here, we can put to bed the idea that anti-Semitism didn't exist. The Forde report very clearly says that there is no evidence of even a single case of anti-Semitism being exaggerated or made up. Indeed, Forde confirms the position of the leaked report in saying that anti-Semitism was and remains a problem for Labour. On the first claim, Forde finds in C1.1 to 1.41 that there was clear evidence of dysfunctional, factionally motivated actions taken by both the leader's staff and the HQ staff. Normally, the leader's office employed between 5 to 10 permanent staff, with the remaining staffing duties handled by the party's HQ at Southside. The Southside staff are supposed to be neutral workers in the party machine, akin to the civil service for the UK government. It's not supposed to matter who is in charge. They are there to execute the vision of the elected leader in the best way they can. Forde, in the first part of this section, in C1.1, made it clear that there has been a long-standing tension in the past over leaders to the left, partly because of a suspicion from previous infiltration attempts by communists in the 50s and 60s and militant in the 80s. And whilst traditionally the party staff has reflected the broad view of Labour's breadth, after the Blair years it became increasingly monocultural. Every single leader elected from the left, that is Foot, Kinnock, Miliband and Corbyn, all face suspicion. In C1.8, Forde makes it clear that by 2015 the party staff at Southside had abandoned even the appearance of neutrality and officials were acting far beyond their capacity. Traditionally, soft left leaders and the party staff consolidated after that initial period of suspicion from both sides, but on this occasion there was no attempt or real interest from either side. Due to actions taken by party staff that are described further down, there was the worry of sabotage by the leader's office, and the party staff believed that the leader's office was looking to replace them and weren't at all enthusiastic about working for a leader they had such vehement ideological objections to. This was exacerbated by the unprecedented number of staff hired towards Corbyn's office. As I said earlier, traditionally the leader had 5 to 10 people staffing their office. Corbyn had 40. Forde makes it clear that there was significant confusion over what the roles of many of the staff were, with significant overlap between HQ duties and leader staff duties. This overlap made ungainly struggles for control over the same responsibilities an inevitability. Was Corbyn right to suspect obstructionism? I would like to say no, he wasn't, but all evidence stands to the contrary. In C1.4 onwards, Forde makes it clear that some senior HQ staff saw the membership surge and Corbyn's election as illegitimate and undesirable. Many took the position that whilst they couldn't stop it, they could let the Corbyn project implode and keep the party machine running so that when that happened, the Labour Party would survive. With the steady self-segregation into echo chambers, particularly WhatsApp groups, both sides highlighted their animosity to the other, even though, as some staff testified, when working together in the early period, they realised that despite being ideological tentpoles apart, they had much in common. However, as Forde regretfully notes, there simply wasn't a widespread effort to bond the two together, and so the echo chambers destroyed what could have been a fruitful working relationship. All involved admit that the organisation of the leader's staff was quite chaotic, and this stems from Corbyn himself, having never organised nor run anything in his life. He simply didn't have the operational knowledge to adequately control his own staff and coordinate the party machine. Corbyn's staff say they were never offered help. HQ staff say it was made clear their help wasn't welcome. Nobody talked to each other, and so nothing got fixed. From C1.30 onwards, Forde makes it clear that the SMT WhatsApp transcripts, despite context softening them a little, show evidence of an attitude pervading HQ staff that went far beyond what could be considered appropriate standards of behaviour. The messages veered into the discriminatory and disgusting. On the second claim, on misbehaviour in the GLU, and particular around the handling of antisemitism, Forde had this to say. There was a consistent and persistent lack of clarity on what should be defined as antisemitism, what the standards were, and how to implement them. This compounded the fact that the disciplinary process was simply not equipped to handle a membership of that size. Amidst all of this, there was significant confusion over what the role of the leader's office should be in that disciplinary system. Traditionally, the leader's office simply signed off on actions the GLU took regarding the disciplinary process. However, this sign-off seemed to invite commentary and interference from Corbyn's office. As Forde sets out, despite many Corbyn supporters' belief that the GLU held up antisemitism cases, the evidence suggests that due to undue pressure from the leader's office in certain high-profile cases, the GLU felt compelled to refer their decisions to the leader's office for approval. This was improper, not according to the rulebook, and clearly wrong, especially when that pressure was put on to try and find the leader's friends and allies not guilty on offences pertaining to anti-Semitism. The example Forde cites is Ken Livingstone. It's pretty clear that the GLU struggled under the weight of the political pressure put upon it, and so improperly referred cases to the leader's office to cover their own back. This was wrong from the GLU and wrong from the leader's office to allow. Forde also looks at the validation exercises in 2015 and 16, which were designed, on the face of it, to root out people who weren't supposed to be members. Now let me be clear, communists have never been allowed to be part of the Labour Party, not in the 1930s and not now. The rulebook prohibits it, and it is right to root out people who shouldn't be members of the party. Having said that, Forde demonstrates clearly in C 2.8 onwards that the allegations of improper vetting in the leaked report are true. It's clear in 2.9, 2.13 through to 2.32 that HQ staff deliberately aimed to remove members who they believed were sympathetic to Corbyn. Through improper behaviour in the office, such as laughing loudly about going trot hunting, to deliberately omitting left-wing MPs from search filters designed to catch abusive language towards MPs, to looking for flimsy pretexts to reject or remove members. The HQ discredited their actions and, even more importantly, discredited their reputation to such a point that the trust between members and the GLU was broken. This then allowed conspiracy theories around anti-Semitism to take hold. Moving on to the third allegation, that factionalism impacted the normal functioning of the party, and this is pretty cut and dried. I don't think anyone in the party will deny that this was a serious problem in the Corbyn years. Even those inclined to disagree with the report are unanimous on this, so I'm not going to belabor this point. What I will say is this. Often there were some very different perspectives that, whilst valid, weren't listened to when they should have been. Forde cites the community organising scheme as one of the biggest examples of this. Community organising was an exciting prospect that took a completely new way of campaigning, built on something that the New Left were doing in the United States and other countries. It's a genuinely interesting idea, but untested as far as the UK goes. HQ rightly brought up some issues, chiefly that it bypasses those with a legal responsibility for being accountable for ensuring electoral law is followed, and had a high risk of allowing persistent breaches of electoral law by good faith activists who didn't know any better. There was no compromise and no discussion between the two, because those in HQ considered it a reckless method that went against what they knew to work, and did work in the 97 to 2010 period. The leader's staff wouldn't compromise because they viewed the expertise of the HQ staff as little more than a plot to derail what was an election promise to the membership. One of the biggest issues was the consistent chaos in the leader's office. I mentioned this earlier as a big problem because of Corbyn's inexperience, and it's borne out in C3.4 of the report, where it makes it clear that there were often 3 or 4 staff assigned to exactly the same portfolio, expecting to be working solo. It caused friction, tension, and lack of clarity over who was doing what at any given time. This consistent chaos led to low staff morale, made it easier to enter factional echo chambers, and worse, prevented the implementation of Labour's aims because there was no actual management of what was going on. The attack-counter-attack cycle through leaks also continued unabated, and the chaos only got worse when individuals started to share multiple versions of documents across platforms without a clear paper trail in order to smoke out leakers. The fourth allegation is one that has been heard over and over and over. The insiders in the party sabotaged the 2017 election. This is usually accompanied by a dubious claim that Labour were 2,000 votes short of government in 2017, which is simply untrue. This allegation is huge, and the leaked report purporting to show this was equally huge. For Labour, it would be truly disastrous if their own staff sabotaged the party in an election to prevent a leader they didn't agree with from governing the country. To break this down, first Forde found that all sides had initially agreed on primarily a defensive strategy. With the polls being what they were, nobody disagreed that May had called the election at the absolute worst time for Labour, and that it was projected Labour would lose huge. Therefore, resources were deployed in a manner consistent with minimising the damage from a loss. As the polls started to turn, the leader's office wanted to switch to a far more aggressive strategy, and HQ disagreed, remaining sceptical of the polling shift. Some resources also couldn't be redeployed with any great speed, with a quote in Forde being, "Oil tankers are slow to turn around, not because of the refractory attitudes regrettably common amongst the sorts who captain them, but because they're oil tankers." Forde makes it clear that until the Manchester Arena bombing and May's U-turn on the dementia tax, reticence was justified, because at that point the polls hadn't sufficiently narrowed. It is pretty clear that HQ staff stayed within their legal requirements to party and electoral rules, but were they right in what they did? This really depends on where you fall. Forde finds that there was an operation set up in Ergon House, an overflow office for HQ staff, designed to conceal the use of funding, an extra £135,000 towards certain seats that were political opponents of Jeremy Corbyn. On the face of this seems utterly abhorrent and a clear breach of what HQ staff were supposed to do. And yet, further down, Forde makes the point that he received several statements that oral instructions were given on which seats were to lose funding in favour of marginal attack seats. The seats to lose funding and which were at risk were all vocal critics of Corbyn, and indeed, Forde notes in C.439, out of the 13 seats on that list of support from Ergon House, 8 were lost in 2019, which would indicate a vulnerability. All of the seats that were to be defunded in the oral instructions were Corbyn skeptic seats. All of the seats to gain funding were being contested by Corbyn supporters. Forde does make the point that in the context of Labour's total electoral budget of 11 million, 135,000 is a small amount. In conclusion, on this point around Ergon House funding, Forde finds both factions within Labour were at that point influencing electoral strategy to shore up their own internal positions, something that is extraordinary and shocking in the extreme, and whilst HQ stayed within the law, they were morally wrong to attempt to conceal this operation even if they were justified in doing so. Going back to the overall accusations of sabotage, Forde makes it clear that many HQ staff grappled with the incredibly difficult position of fighting an election with a leader they didn't believe in or agree with. It is a difficult position and one I can empathise with. By 2018, I myself was convinced that Labour would not win an election with Jeremy Corbyn at the helm, and I had to work out whether it was worth it to me to keep campaigning as hard as I was for Labour. Others also had to make that choice. This is not a new thing. If anything, it is a common feature in most broad party systems because it is rare to find a leader who can truly offer the breadth of party support all that they want. Did this difficult position constitute sabotage? Forde finds not. In C.4.47, he outlines the issues in that HQ staff, trapped in their echo chambers, were incredibly reluctant to admit there was a chance of winning, and incredulous when that started to happen. Lotto staff were simply unwilling to accept any expertise from HQ staff, and like a mirror image of HQ staff, were too focused on shoring up Corbyn's power bases inside the party. This didn't make for an effective strategy at all, and a unified and focused Labour Party may have done better, but there's simply no evidence of deliberate sabotage. Forde makes no attempt to wargame what could have happened, whether or not this cost Labour the 2017 election, but I will. So let's depart from the Forde report for a moment. I've oft heard the 12 seats away from government, or 2,227 votes from government. It's a bold, eye-catching claim, and one that is simply not true. If Labour gained another 12 seats, they would have needed to form a coalition with every other party in the Commons, minus the Conservatives, to govern. The Lib Dems under Tim Farron were all over the place on what they wanted and didn't want. The SNP were and are interested in only one thing, to the exclusion of all others, and will enable a Tory government or bring down a Labour government in order to achieve it. Independence at all costs. Already, you've got two huge hurdles to clear there. Then you've got the minor parties such as the Greens or the DUP or Plaid Cymru, who all had contrasting views. A grand coalition such as this has never existed in modern British political history. In fact, I'm struggling to think of any instance outside of a Second World War, and that took the immense skill of titans such as Churchill, Attlee, Bevan, Cripps and others. To even form such a coalition would be an immense challenge and take a huge amount of political skill, something I'm sure that even Corbyn's most ardent supporters would agree he lacked. In addition to this, the Liberal Democrats had already made it clear they would not support a Labour government with Jeremy Corbyn at its helm. The DUP were in favour of Brexit, the Lib Dems wanted a second referendum, and with Swinson wanted it reversed without a referendum. The SNP were interested in only causing as much chaos as possible in order to further the Westminster dysfunction argument. Does anyone seriously think that is a recipe for a Corbyn-led government? In reality, Labour would have needed enough seats to take the SNP out of the equation entirely, and even then, that might not have been enough. Going back to Forde, the fifth allegation is one that hasn't received much press attention, but should be thought-provoking to all inside Labour, from centre-right the way out to the left. This is about professionalism, diversity of thought, and good working relationships. Labour has always made a big thing about being a big tent and containing lots of diverse opinions and ideas. Often, this hasn't always been welcome, and many times one side has attacked or attempted to suppress the other. Tony Blair was notorious for this, as were attempts by the left through Militant and Momentum. Over the years, a culture of nepotism and improper practices, such as staff hiring in their own ideological image or promoting based on that, has resulted in the creation of a monochamber, an echo chamber within HQ. Whereas once you could depend on HQ reflecting the image of the party, it was now controlled almost entirely by a particular ideological trend. Corbyn wanted to break that up, and in doing so hired a parallel staff which ironically acted in the exact same fashion, but simply from the left. When you pair this with selective enforcement of the rules, and you have a recipe for an unmitigated disaster. For a party that aspires to be the primary vehicle of progressive ideas and workers' liberation, you simply cannot allow such a toxic culture to infest the heart of the party. Moving on to the final allegation, it's hard to read what Forde has reported. I'm a progressive, but I'm not infallible. In the past, I've made statements that I now know aren't right and unjust, and had someone told me then, I'd probably have reacted with anger, because as a progressive, I can't possibly be any of those, can I? It's often hard for those in the progressive movement to accept that sometimes we hold opinions or thoughts rooted in assumption and ignorance. We have to do better. Forde makes it clear that there is a culture, a toxic culture, of sexism, misogyny, Islamophobia and racism inside Labour. Whilst evidence of homophobia was lacking and no submissions relating to transphobia were made, I have enough anecdotal evidence to know, and as Forde agrees, that both are also present inside the party. What more can be said beyond it needs rooting out? What more needs to be said that Labour needs to deal with what is seen as a perceived hierarchy of racism? So long as Labour doesn't clean house and institute a proper, fair culture, and most importantly, applies it equally across the board, Labour will struggle at convincing people that it is truly fulfilling its aim at being the electoral vehicle for justice, equality and fairness for all in the UK and not just a select few. So that's the Forde report. I would say this, as I said earlier, it doesn't exonerate anyone. It exposes what happens when a party riven by disagreements loses sight of the larger goal, when members become so enthralled to a person or an ideology that they fail to see what is going on. And that doesn't just apply to Corbynites, it applies to Blairites too. I've made no bones about my admiration for Tony Blair's ability, his political skill, and his material outcomes. I've also never hid my fierce criticism for his actions on Iraq, his inability to structurally change the UK, and his lack of ambition in doing so. Just like I've never hid my admiration for Corbyn's ideological tenets while also decrying his incompetence, lack of political skill, and his unwillingness to get to real grips with the anti-Semitism problem. Personally, I'd have liked to have seen Corbynism without Corbyn post 2017, but that can't happen until the left reconstructs itself into a machine aimed not at talking amongst ourselves, but at talking outwards and in a constructive manner. Just as Blairites can't treat the members, and indeed the electorate, with contempt, neither can Corbynites. Labour members must do better at recognising that the world is far greyer than our ideological camps would have us believe, and our certainty of belief renders us blind and inflexible at a time when we desperately need bold leadership and the ability to stretch across divides. The cost of living crisis is only going to get worse. The climate is deteriorating faster, and Putin seeks to put his boot on the neck of much of the world. That requires a party focused on providing that leadership and a clear direction, rather than the lack of it, from the right-wing parties of the world. It also requires a party focused on winning elections and not internal battles within Labour. I'd like to leave you something I heard Neil Kinnock say to me in an event for Labour Comms. There are too many inside Labour who aim not to see Labour in power, but aim to be in power in Labour. Thank you for listening. I'd like to thank all of my friends online and in real life who have listened to me rage about this and put up with it for far too long. If you like the content, help the channel grow by sharing and subscribing. You've heard what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And thank you and goodbye.